The state that did that calls themselves a Jewish state. They call themselves a Jewish state, meaning, whereas I make a distinction between Jews and Zionists, the state doesn't. I want to step into this when we get the opportunity. But my man is here. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. How you doing, Mark? You doing okay this morning or this afternoon?
Tomorrow, I'm alive. How the hell are you? Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
And just for people to know, you can find Mark on Boosty, Boosty, under Real Politic with Mark Sleboda. All of his videos, all of his insight is effectively on that location. Definitely check him out. Great analyst, to put it mildly. Mark, I'm doing okay. My internet signal is a bit dodgy, so I had to switch to my phone. So hopefully there's not going to be any issue with it, and we can make it through the 3 hours for the day, and I'll flip back. I'll figure out how to fix it by tomorrow.
Is that your real background?
That is indeed my real background. That is indeed my real background. Yeah. You're impressed, right? Impressed.
Actually, I was going to say it hurts my eyes, but I'm a creature of the darkness, so.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's the apartment is nice. I can't complain. Can't complain. Got a question. The Turkish ship, and I guess there are three questions that I want to hit, but the first one, the Turkish ship in Odessa port. In fact, I guess it was 3 ships that got damaged. But I watched this video where it looks like a drone flew in and effectively decimated a Turkish ship. And I kept thinking to myself, is this a message to Erdogan? What's going on with this?
Yeah, so there was a major Russian attack on Odessa port.
Yes.
And the Odessa region. And this involved hundreds of drones. It also involved ballistic missiles, Iskander ballistic missiles. It involved Caliber cruise missiles. And reportedly, it also involved Kinjal hypersonic missiles, as well as, a large number of Garans. And there was specifically, obviously targeted, was a Turkish cargo ship that was docked and evidently had been there for some time. It didn't just arrive. And although initial reports were that it was hit by an Iskander, a ballistic missile, that because the reports were coming out as I was doing my own week in review on Friday, and the reports were just coming out, and I reported as they were that it was a Iskander ballistic missile. But later the videos came out, and it does appear to be a Garan Type 3 drone that hits it, doing the damage. Now, this ship, was on its face a Turkish flagged civilian vessel. According to Russian sources, of course, it was carrying both military equipment and electrical repair equipment.
Yeah.
It's not a secret. It's open knowledge that Turkey has been supplying military vehicles, ammunition, artillery shells, for the Kiev regime all along, right? This is Erdogan being classic Erdogan, the cunning beast, not only playing both sides off of each other, but profiting off of both sides. He does business with Russia and sells Russian oil and gas to Turkey, that he essentially launders with others and then transfers to Europe as non-Russian gas, just like India does with oil. And he conducts normal trade with Russia. Turkey is highly dependent on Russia, for instance, for energy, right? It's their primary energy supplier and so on. but at the same time, he sells military equipment to the Kiev regime. So he's been profiting off both sides
Both sides.
of this affair. And so now it wasn't just, of course, this cargo ship. There were extensive port facilities, energy infrastructure. Odessa is blacked out, right? I mean, completely cut off from power. And that, of course, is affecting heating and running water, too. And the last report that I saw, the Kiev regime officials still days later have no idea when they're going to be able to restore power to the majority of Odessa. So it was a strong,
Massive
definitive
attack.
hit, and letting us know that the Kiev regime is teetering on the edge of, on the precipice with their energy infrastructure at this point. Russia has them to the point, I think, the point they want, where they can literally shut down either large parts of the electricity grid or the entirety of it at will. And the Kiev regime increasingly has very limited power to conduct repairs. And this is in large part due to Russian increase of production and the capabilities of the Garan, of the long-range strike drones that all make all of this cost effective, right? Because the Kiev regime, first of all, the energy infrastructure in Ukraine was built by the Soviet Union. So it was built with incredible amount of redundancies and options for rediverting power, and it was made to be resilient. So Russia had to spend a considerable amount of resources degrading that down, and also the ability of the Kiev regime to repair it. Now they have very limited repair parts and capability left. And the whole Soviet electrical system is not compatible with Western electrical supplies. So it's not like they can simply replace substations and the like, making it very difficult. In fact, the Kiev regime has actually been getting electrical repair supplies via Azerbaijan for some time. Azerbaijan also having a Soviet legacy, and Azerbaijan for some time continuing to buy these supplies from Russia and then reselling them to Ukraine until Russia put a stop to that. But that was continuing for some time. Global economy, right? There's ways of Russia has found many ways of doing things through middlemen and third partners, despite sanctions and secondary sanctions and everything else. So, but hitting this cargo ship, of course, was a message to the Kiev regime. Putin outright said, right? I mean, this was a message not only to the Kiev regime, but to its Western backers. And despite his, shall we say, a unique position of playing both sides of the other, that does also include Turkey, because Turkey has been supplying the Kiev regime with weapons, and they are a part of NATO. So that needs to be, even if they have a unique geopolitical position that gives them, shall we say, a degree of independence and agency that most other members of NATO don't have. So a warning first to the Kiev regime that if you continue your attacks on civilian ships in the Black Sea that are doing trade with Russia, and let's recall there have been 4 of them so far, and none of them were Russian flagged ships, right? So 3 of them were oil tankers, and they were on their way to pick up oil in the port of Novorossiysk and then take it to India or to China or to Turkey or wherever. And one of them was simply a sunflower, a tanker carrying sunflower oil. And that one was hit not with unmanned boats, not with surface water drones, but with regular aerial UAVs, drones. So there have been 4 such attacks in the last 2 weeks. And Putin outright said, if you do this, we have 2 options, right? We can quid pro quo. And this was a definitive message to the Western countries that support Kiev regime, we can go after any civilian traffic that aids the Kiev regime. And we know that you're transporting a lot of weapons on a lot of this civilian traffic. I mean, you may think that we don't know, but we do know. So there's that. And then if it becomes necessary, we can just shut Odessa port down completely, right? And a lot of Russian analysts have noted that these attacks really just give Russia, the primary thing they do is actually to make it really impossible for Russia to end this conflict without taking Odessa. Because they see how it can be used against them and will be used against them in the future. And so, again, a historically Russian-speaking, city, it gives them all the further justification and pretext they need to take Odessa. But they have multiple options for shutting down Odessa, and we saw part of that this weekend. We saw both. Putin replied actually in both ways, because he hit this cargo ship at port in Odessa, but he also hit another cargo ship that was that was at sea, Ukraine's exclusive economic zone as well. That was also hit. But they also hit Odessa port infrastructure and electrical infrastructure in a big way. And that's, one way Russia could shut down Odessa that way. I mean, one such attack is not going to completely shut them down, but let's just say that losing the electrical infrastructure to, power to all of Odessa, well, that prevents things from being processed at the docks as well, right? I mean, it stops transportation, it stops trains from carrying stuff away, stops the lifting crane, stops everything. So Russia has other options, though. For instance, they could easily flood the entirety of the waters around Odessa with sea mines. That's cheap. Russia has plenty of them. They can be dropped. They can be released from submarines. They can be dropped from planes. They can be dropped from drones. There's all sorts of ways. Russia doesn't even have to put their navy at risk of attack in order to do that. But Putin has already responded, and he responded quicker and more forcibly than it should be said that I predicted. When I was initially reporting on this. So he's taking this extremely seriously. He warned, we will hit, if you hit civilian ships that are doing trade with us, and again, there have been 4, none of them Russian flagged, they were none of them Russian owned. You can refer to them as Russia's shadow fleet, but they're not Russian. Shadow fleet just means ships that aren't insured in London, right? And they're just part of maritime commerce, right? They're ships that are owned, either by a captain or a company that sees that money can be made by picking up oil or some other product in Russia and taking it somewhere else, or vice versa, and taking it to Russia. And you can call that shadow fleet all you want, but all it is the global maritime shipping industry for most of it. Russia doesn't actually own most of it, right? So that is an attack, again, on really global economy. And what we see here, as with its own patron, the United States, as we've seen in the Caribbean, and as we found out in the Wall Street Journal about an attack on a Chinese ship in the Pacific that was on the way to Iran. These are acts of state piracy. The U.S. long makes this justification for its saber-rattling naval parades up and down off the Chinese coast, the Russian coast, freedom of navigation. Well, the only real threat to the freedom of navigation and to free maritime commerce in the world is the United States and its allies non-compliant states like the Kiev regime, as we're seeing in the Black Sea. And again, it has to be said that Russia is responding in kind, right? The Ukrainian side attacked civilian ships doing trade with Russia, and they attacked international energy infrastructure on Russian territory. They also multiple times attacked, by the way, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium at the port of Novorossiysk, and this is internationally owned. It doesn't. Most of the gas it transports, the energy it transports, is not even Russian. The majority of it is Kazakh. Some of it is Turkmen. Right, the ownership of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, the U.S. companies, Mobil and Chevron, are heavily invested in it, as is the Kazakh state energy concern and a couple of Russian energy companies. So it's an international consortium. And I said most of the energy transported isn't Russian. It's actually from Kazakhstan and a couple of other Central Asian countries. So that was an attack on global energy infrastructure, really, that are part of the global market. So, and Russia said we will respond in kind, and Russia has, and they've also, at least temporarily, for the moment, taken down Odessa port as well.
Did Erdogan get the message?
Did Erdogan? Oh yeah, Erdogan got the message, and it should be said that Putin and Erdogan actually had a meeting.
5 hours.
This meeting was on the sidelines of a kind of an international multilateral summit in Turkmenistan that mostly included countries from Central Asia, plus Russia, Turkey, and I believe India and Pakistan were both there as well. And there are, Putin and Erdogan did have a meeting on the sides. We don't know everything they talked about, but they did talk about the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm sure from the pictures we show that show both men sitting to each other. I mean, reading body language is really a not good means of doing analysis, but still, it must be said, neither man appears to be smiling, and it is almost certain. But Turkey has put it out, and without casting any specific blame on Russia or on Ukraine, they said that conflict on the Black Sea must end. It threatens everyone, and we've already seen that, because the cost of insurance for all ships, right, particularly but not only on the Black Sea, but particularly on the Black Sea, the cost of insurance for shipping has jumped wildly, of course, since these attacks perpetrated by the Kiev regime began a few weeks ago. So it's already having an expected effect, and we'll see if they continue. If Erdogan is able. There was actually an article in The Atlantic, of all places. The Atlantic, for those who don't know, is an extremely pro-Western, pro-liberal, very anti-Russian magazine publication, a magazine and online publication. And even The Atlantic had a headline article calling these attacks on civilian tankers an act of desperation by the Kiev regime, by the Ukrainian government, and to hear that admitted by The Atlantic, I mean it means that they really are desperate. I mean, there's no question. That's the very first thing many other people said, that this is a sign of desperation. Now, part of the desperation is, of course, how bad things are going on the battlefield. But another part of the desperation, and another thing that this indicates, is that the Kiev regime / Western, and we know the New York Times has told us that the U.S. was actively assisting the Kiev regime in attacking Russia's oil refineries and oil depots in the past few months. And that was supposed to be some crippling damage to Russian economy that would make Russia come to the negotiating table on American terms to end the conflict. It did not. It did not come even close to that. In fact, we had a report out by Reuters a few weeks ago that admitted this and gave us, some international combined statistics to show this. But evidently, according to the international agencies that collect such data, the Russian refined oil has only going to for export has only decreased by 3% year on year. That is the combined effect, if we want to call it that, right? No more than that, anyway, of all of these attacks that have been blown up in the Kiev regime and thus Western propaganda to be, half of Russia's oil refining capacity has been destroyed. Russia's in flames. This nonsense about
gas lines
and gas lines and everything. By the way, that was debunked in no less a source than the Moscow Times. Moscow Times, of course, is not a Russian newspaper. It has nothing any more to do with Moscow. It was long owned as a Western information outlet. It was bought up quite a while ago by Dutch, by fronts for the Dutch government. Since the conflict in 2022, they have been kicked out of Russia, and now they're still operating the Moscow Times out of the Netherlands. But there was a report even in there where they did an extensive poll of Russians all across Russia, but particularly in the south, where the shortages were said to be, again, blown out of all proportion with hopium and wishful thinking out of Western and Kiev regime propaganda. They polled people that were car owners. They polled quite a number of them, and what they found was there really wasn't any shortages. That 90% of it was exaggeration, and what is a seasonal thing during August in this part of the country, because it's the subtropical part of Russia, Crimea and the Sochi coast. And August is the vacation month in Russia, and a large portion of the country is on vacation. And a large portion of it, particularly with all the problems with international travel and spending tourist money abroad they have right now for Russian banks being sanctioned, is they do domestic travel like many Americans do, right? They get in their car and they take a vacation within their own country. And there's a lot of Russia to take vacation in. And if you want a beach, you wouldn't believe it, but there are beaches in Russia, right? Again, in this south and the Crimea. Russia's a big country. Yeah, there's a lot of it in the north, but there's some of it in the south too. And that's where these shortages supposedly occurred. And it turns out that most of that was no different than the average seasonal phenomenon of large number of tourists, the Russian touristers on vacation there in the south, filling up their cars, and where lines during that brief period of time is, nothing unusual. And if there were local shortages on one small privately owned gas station, that no one had any problem then finding another gas station in the same area where they did have gas. So the Moscow Times actually debunked that whole, propaganda myth. That, hey, thanks for that, I'll take it.
Well, speaking of that, you made the point of saying they're in crisis. This is reeks of desperation.
Yeah. And so if the attempts to shut down the refineries didn't work, right, then you choose a softer target, right? And that is the civilian shipping in the Black Sea. It's closer, and it's less well defended and harder to defend, it must be said. And so that's why the desperation. That's why, because the other tactic has failed.
There's also desperation because they've just lost Seversk Fortress City, which
in the northern Donbass, north central Donbass. Yeah.
And this comes immediately after Volchansk, Pokrovsk. Minograd is surrounded with mop-up operations at this point. So all of these are falling back to back to back at this point.
And there's a war coming because Russia is already fighting in Konstantinovka at the southern end of the last defensive line in the Donbass. They're already fighting in Liman, or as the Russians call it, Krasny Liman. They're already fighting in Gulai Polya. Russia did take Kupiansk several weeks ago. Now, the Kiev regime has launched large counterattacks, very intensive counterattacks as part of a political and PR campaign, counterattacks on Kupiansk and the Kupiansk area that were accompanied by what was supposedly Zelensky posing in front of the stela, the name of the city in big letters, about a kilometer and a half or 2 kilometers outside the city. Although I originally believed that he was probably there, but it might have been recorded earlier. Now there's increasing evidence that this was more green screen magic, because both Russian and Ukrainians have gone there with drones. And there are a lot of very specific details that differ. The damage done to the stela, some local anti-drone nets over the roads there, a lot of things that seem to indicate that this was a fictional, a AI movie assisted, a green screen shot that Zelensky took there. And there's no question there that the Kiev regime is doing very intensive counterattacks there. However, Russia is still in control of Kupiansk city, even if there is heavy fighting on the outskirts of it in the area around it. And in order to do this, the Kiev regime has had to strip forces from everywhere else, particularly in the northern parts of the contact line in Sumy and Chornogov, but also in Western Ukraine. And a lot of these are also fresh conscripts. The Kiev regime is no longer hiding the fact, they're openly admitting they are not conducting training of forced conscripts anymore. They will be trained at the front, on the battleground. That's what they call training, meat.
It means they're going to die.
Essentially. And the effects of this is, yes, they're able to do a lot of fog of war. Oh, we never lost Kupiansk, and at the same time, we're taking Kupiansk back, and Zelensky's showing up there. But Russia has reignited the contact line in Sumy and Chornogov, of course, taking, exploiting the situation. And the Kiev regime, this is just sacrificing more of their manpower in what are largely pointless and political counterattacks, right? Done for the sake of saying for them to argue out one side of their mouth that they haven't taken or they have retaken part of Kupiansk. But the cost of this, right? Because all of these troops are being spent in very manpower intensive counterattacks when they would be much better spent, right, in defensive positions, right? The losses in counterattacks obviously are much higher than they are in defensive positions. And this is especially true when you're using fresh conscripts, because it's much easier to defend the position with an automatic weapon, a trench or something, than it is to storm across, urban assault, under heavy drone attack and the like. That's very difficult. It requires a lot of experience and combat skills if you don't want to end up immediately dead in the process. It's hard enough normally, much less with someone who has no combat training or skills or ability whatsoever. So this is all extremely expensive and futile. It's just another version of the Kursk Fool's Crusade. Again, done for mostly political and PR reasons. And it's one of the reasons why Kiev regime is losing so decidedly at this point, is because they keep throwing away their manpower and resources for political reasons rather than military strategic reasons.